And this is Wade Frazier. This is November 17th, 2025, 4:43 p.m. In my previous video, I sketched, you know, the stories are so long and wild, it would take forever to discuss them all, really. But so I sketched out Dennis Lee's early adventures, particularly his early failed business ventures. Again, his home building effort that got wiped out during the United States' first energy crisis back in 73, 74. And after that failed, and again, Dennis got hoodwinked into pleading guilty for fraud for bouncing checks, unintentionally bouncing checks in the mayhem of what happened. And he got intentionally bad legal advice. That plea haunts him to this day. Well, when that was over, and again, his child died, his wife left him. It was everything came to a head. And so after that catastrophe, Dennis sort of went into a room, and for 3 days, all he did was write. In fact, Dennis said it seemed like it was automatic writing, that it really wasn't him doing it. Okay, I'll buy some of that. It's he maybe, let's say, maybe divinely inspired by what happened. And when he came out, he came up with a business plan. Basically, it was a concept. The company he founded on the concept was called United Community Services, or UCS. And the idea was to unite the consumer and help small businesses to essentially level the playing field of capitalism so the big corporations didn't dominate everybody. That was essentially what the inspiration was for that. And so basically, it was a coupon card that people would use at various businesses, and then they'd essentially get money back. In fact, years later, Dennis's first employer, old employee Sears, came up with a watered down version of Dennis's concept called the Discover Card, which saves as people use it. Dennis, in fact, until I came along and Boston became Dennis's partner, he never started his companies with any capital. It was always just Dennis's amazing salesmanship ability, entrepreneurial skill, and fast feet, fast thinking, fast talking, and surviving in the capitalist Shark Tank, get businesses going. Not an easy trick. I've watched him do it. That was amazing to watch him do that with his wife. His wife was his sidekick for all that stuff. And I sure couldn't do it. It was amazing. Um, and also what Dennis did is he'd make it look easy. So Dennis would do these things, and which I know was extremely difficult, but he'd make it look easy. In fact, that was also part of the peril of what he did, because he made it look so easy that people thought, oh, I could do this. Or I just steal his company, then I could do it. This kind of thing. And it's wrong. Yeah, only Dennis was able to drive those boats. I mean, that was only Dennis could make that stuff happen the way he did it. Interestingly, Dennis, as I mentioned in the previous video, he fled the West Coast, fled Alaska, fleeing the mob, the West Coast mob, and ends up going to New Jersey of all places. Then again, hobnobs with the Eastern oligarchy. It goes to Fairleigh Dickinson University, and and then he started his home building business, and then he tried this United Community Services business. And he was constantly fending off the mafia. In New Jersey, almost every street corner had some mafia lieutenant looking for opportunities. And so he was constantly fending off mafia members who were trying to buy into his businesses, to muscle in on his businesses, all this kind of stuff. In fact, early on, one of his earliest experiences of this was a mob lieutenant started trying to work his way in, and then one day he admitted it that, yeah, we're the mob. And this mobster said, it could be heaven if you work for us, but hell if you don't. And Dennis, being the brash ex-soldier, said, well, if it could be heaven, you must be an angel, so you can fly. And Dennis picked this mobster up and threw him down a stairwell, broke his arm, and stuff. In fact, called the hospital to come get this piece of garbage off his, off his curb. And then Dennis went upstairs, went home, and told his wife, we're moving like in a half hour. And Dennis, he moved 2 towns away, thinking that he had now escaped the mob. And about 2 weeks later, they caught up with him. In fact, he was walking out of the building, and just as walking out, 2 guys walk in, and one of them says, "Did anybody know, does Dennis Lee live here?" And Dennis goes, "Never heard of him." And Dennis tried to walk past him. And next thing Dennis knew, he was looking at a pearl-handled revolver poked into his nose. And they go, "Nice try." Back in. So they backed him into this building, the apartment building where he lived. And it was one of these buildings that had the internal stairwell, like in the movies. So he lived up on the 3rd floor, whatever floor that was. And so they started backing him up with a gun in his face. They're backing him up to his apartment to kill him. And in fact, his wife was in there. And so Dennis, a couple things. One is he would not let them kill his wife. He would die before he let that happen. And the other thing was Dennis thought real fast. And so he actually started begging for his life loudly as he's backing up the stairs with a gun in his nose. And anyway, his wife got it. She understood, and she called the cops. And what happened was that, and they keep backing him up, and they got up to right up to his apartment, almost to the door. And Dennis was going to make his move. And Dennis was ex-special forces, knew how to kill with his hands. And somebody was going to die before they ever got in his apartment. And just before Dennis was going to make his move, the police come in, the bottom floor. Hey, there was a fight going on here and stuff. And of course, here's a hitman, and they holster their guns. And Dennis, and this is Dennis. So what Dennis did was he yelled down the cops, "Oh, help, officer! No, we were just having a friendly argument. No big deal." And he took both the hitmen and he sort of put his arms around their shoulders and he marched down the stairwell with these 2 hitmen out past the cops, out to the street, and Dennis escorted to their car. And smiling, laughing like these were really buddies of his. Anyway, then they get to the car, and the guys get in the car, and on the driver's side window, and Dennis has them roll it down, and Dennis says, "Okay, I want you to tell your boss that it ain't worth it, because you or I were going to die before you got into my apartment, and just tell him it wasn't worth it. It's not worth it." Well, anyway, because he could have had obviously those hitmen busted. It might have been a horrible shootout, whatever. But the way Dennis resolved the situation earned the mob's respect. And mafia is a culture of honor. And so anyway, they left him alone after that. In fact, again, they're always mobsters are always trying to muscle in. And a few years later, here comes another mobster trying to muscle his way in. And they disguise themselves at first. In fact, back then, if you asked a mobster what the mafia is, they would just say, "What's that?" That was the game they played. But anyway, what happened was that this guy was, starting to come on, and Dennis stopped him and said, "Hey, I know what you're doing. I'm too honest for you guys. Yeah, this is not going to be used for some scam or whatever. This is, I'm trying to make this business work." And so, in fact, one of your associates, I threw him down a stairwell a few years ago and broke his arm. And this mobster goes, "That was you, huh?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, okay. I'll be on my way." And so anyway, in fact, while Dennis was on the East Coast, he was constantly interacting with mobsters, dealing with mobsters who were trying to muscle in, trying to steal it, trying to break his legs, hanging out the window by his ankles, all these kind of things. Yeah, he had an extensive experience with gangsters there in New Jersey. But the funny thing, I don't know if you want to call it funny or not, but what damaged his efforts more were his business associates. And so he was constantly fending off attempts to steal his companies by his business partners and business associates. And so it wasn't the mafia, it was your business partners. And so this was what Dennis always had to put up with there on the East Coast. And sometimes they were successful. Sometimes Dennis did get his company stolen more than once. But I get ahead of myself a little bit. So anyway, early in his UCS days, again, Dennis didn't believe the fire and brimstone services his mom dragged him to in his migrant farm worker childhood. In fact, sometimes he even asked the preacher, "Do you believe this stuff?" And the more honest ones say, "Well, it's a nice story." But anyway, so Dennis really didn't have any room in his mind for the pieties of organized religion. His religion was American nationalism, as I've mentioned earlier. But early in his United Community Services days, he met this idealistic young woman named Allison. And Allison was Jewish, and she soon became Dennis's wife. And she was his second in command until her death. And she died here a few years ago. And so Dennis was in some kind of debating club back in his UCS days. And anyway, one day, and this is Dennis's story of how it happened to him. He was in a debate, and basically the point of the argument that he was engaging in was that people are incapable of governing themselves. And so Dennis realized that, well, humanity needs a benevolent dictator called God. And so anyway, and so then Dennis somehow realized that the Bible is the Word of God, the literal Word of God, etc. And he still believes that. I'm not a Christian. I'm not into the Bible as the one and only Word of God. But I've been very impressed to see how Dennis uses it in his life. So yeah, so it's almost like, as long as it's loving. In fact, when I saw Dennis in September, I said, here's the deal, God is love. And Dennis agrees with that. And that's enough common ground for Dennis and I, and that's where I am. Is if it's loving, believe whatever you want. As long as it's loving, believe whatever you want. As long as it's loving. But Dennis became quite the Christian fanatic, though, quite a zealot. And it took trips to Israel with his wife. In fact, at one point, tried to build a company with Christians. It was all Christian staff, etc., which was a disaster. Each Christian fights with the other Christians on who's got the best Christian view or whatever. But this United Community Services company, he ran it, and I think he ran for about 2 years, I believe. And it started with nothing. And anyway, he got about $1 million in debt eventually. And Dennis said that wasn't easy, getting $1 million in debt for a company like that. And then Dennis realized that it wasn't going to work. And the time was not right for this to happen. And so anyway, Dennis tried to give it away. He wanted to give away to the Christian community. And what happened was he again, back in his early Christian days, he thought he'd give it to Pat Robertson, the televangelist who ran for president eventually. And anyway, so Dennis tried to give it to Rob. In fact, Dennis eventually interacted with some of Robertson's, frontmen. And Dennis literally had like 10 minutes between Robertson was going from here to there. And Dennis had 10 minutes of his time and started to tell Robertson about this idea, this company, what it was about. And 10 minutes turned into 3 hours. And anyway, Robertson decided that, Dennis wanted to give it to him, but Robertson said, oh, but I'll just invest in it instead. And so Robertson put in $150,000 before his lawyers decided that what Dennis was doing was like a pyramid scheme. And then Robertson listened to his lawyers and walked away from it. And then blamed Dennis for investing the money in it, kind of ludicrously. But anyway, so once Robertson walked away, then it was the end of the UCS. So that was the end of his business. And that was in, I don't know, 70, maybe 77. That was about right. Something like that. And anyway, but yeah, UCS was an example of it. Dennis it was multi-level marketing. And so like Amway. So Amway's multi-level marketing. In fact, we had dealings with the Amway event when I was Dennis's partner. And that's what made it work. The greed factor, I guess, of multi-level marketing, which actually was one of the Achilles heels because Dennis's companies were so explosive. The potential was so great that everybody wanted to steal it. This was part of the problem. And then also the vested interests saw it as a fast growing threat. So they try to wipe it out. So yeah, he had lukewarm allies and many enemies went through all these kinds of adventures. Very few genuine allies. Uh, yeah, so marketing plans like that actually can sow the seeds of their own destruction when greed infects everybody and everybody's thinking how they can try to steal it. Yeah, it was kind of a mixed blessing to have, in my opinion, that kind of. Yeah, Dennis's marketing genius was almost too ingenious for its own good because this has attracted all these people of base motivation. Not only the vested interest protecting their turf, but the mob, his business partners that all think, oh, we just get rid of Dennis and it's all ours. Um, anyway, after UCS died, its death, Dennis got involved with energy conservation. Originally, it was low flow shower heads on the Jersey Shore resorts. And Dennis decided to sell them under a shared savings program. So basically, you put the shower heads on for nothing, but you get a piece of the savings. And then that was it became a hallmark of Dennis's sales programs where the customer was like, what have I got to lose? Kind of thing. So yeah, Dennis pioneered a lot of that kind of marketing. Yeah, it was ingenious marketing programs Dennis would have. And before the oil crisis, before the 73, 74 oil crisis, the United States was the more profligate users of energy. Homes weren't insulated. Those big called them gas guzzlers today, but you had cars getting 10 miles a gallon and this kind of thing. And today's average American uses about 15% less energy than he did in the 1970s, which is actually reflected in our declining standard of living. And I write about this. In fact, again, the Substack post I'm putting up as a summary of this. I link to examples of that. Like, for instance, the house my father bought in 1967. Today it's worth 40 times as much, in nominal dollars, but wages have gone up at most 4 times. So basically, that house is 10 times as expensive in real dollars as it was 1967. And that's a real decline in standard of living by people who need to buy a home. So, yeah, so basically when he bought that house, it was literally bought it for a little over 1 year of wages. And today it's, people are buying it for 10 years of wages. So and that's just one marker of our declining standard of living in the United States. And so what happened was Dennis got involved in what's called the foam insulation business because, well, again, with all that cheap energy, Americans didn't insulate their homes. So homes were not insulated. As in gas guzzlers, again, America's, energy was cheap. So it guided how the United States used its energy. Well, after the energy crisis, people started learning the virtues of conservation. And so homes started becoming insulated. And there were two basic ways, I believe. One was fiberglass insulation, which is a lot of what's, I think on my house is probably fiberglass insulated. Another one was called it was foam insulation. It was urea formaldehyde. And this was big in the 70s. And the problem with the urea formaldehyde was that it could off gas and it could give off formaldehyde. And if it wasn't installed properly, it could off gas and actually present a health hazard to the inhabitants of the home. And in fact, when Dennis got involved in this business and the foam insulation, this brand new industry called urea foam insulation, it was basically the equipment was a man and a hose and a bucket and the foam mix. And what happened was that it was just really inefficient. And again, it was dependent on really bad quality control. So basically, yeah, it was really bad quality control and poorly mixed foam would off gas. It would create a health hazard. So anyway, what Dennis did, and this is the first time I think that I'm aware of that he brought his industrialization genius to a business. And so again, a man and a hose and a bucket and foam mix, I call it the craftsman stage. One man show doing it. And Dennis industrialized it. So what happened was he actually had he trained teams. So one team would actually take off the siding of the house temporarily and drill holes. And then another team would come along with, and Dennis called it a battle wagon, but he had a cart that had the foam in it, but it was computer mixed. So it was perfectly mixed, so it had perfect quality. And then it would just shoot it shoot it in the wall. So this battle wagon would shoot it into the walls. And so then another crew would come behind and put the walls back together again. And so with that concept, Dennis could insulate a neighborhood in a day. Blew away everything else. So yeah, nothing could compete with that. And so anyway, so Dennis all of a sudden was flying high, with his Vermeer formaldehyde business. And of course, his first partner stole the business. And again, this is when he really started having mobster issues. Another time, it really had sort of mobster issues. And in fact, what happened was the fiberglass insulation interests also felt threatened because he was going to take over the industry. And so anyway, so he started getting attacked in the media. In fact, he was called Con Man of the Year in some newspaper there in Maryland at the time. And again, when Dennis would run things like that, again, opportunity and genius would come together, and it'd be these skyrocketing companies, and then everybody around would just look at that. And again, I don't know if it was every third guy or fourth guy, but anyway, it was just all the time people were going, well, I could just steal this. I could just steal this company, and then I could just sit back, kick my feet up on the desk, and watch the money roll in. And that was a constant issue. And the times they were successful, and they would be successful in stealing these companies, and then, well, without Dennis to run the show, it would collapse. Whether you're a mobster or a business associate, it would collapse. And then, yeah, it wasn't as easy. Dennis made it look easier than it really was. And so these guys were killing the golden goose over and over and over again because they were blinded by the greed of watching Dennis's skyrocketing companies. Again, this is the double-edged sword of what Dennis did. He was too brilliant for our idiotic business world. And so, what Dennis brought to it was high genius. Yeah, amazing talent Dennis had for that. Like I've never seen anybody like Dennis in that regard. In one such incident, again, back in the phone business, there was, and again, what happened is these people would steal his companies, and mobsters would steal his companies, and the companies would collapse. And then of course, they'd blame Dennis. So no, Dennis was at fault. So the company they stole should have been, amazing, right? It's like stealing a car and has a flat tire, and so you go and kill the guy whose car you stole because they had a flat tire. I mean, that's how stupid these people were. But anyway, yeah, quite peculiar logic. Um, anyway, once that's incident, after they stole his company, then it collapsed, and the mobsters are going to break Dennis's legs. And anyway, they were coming to break his legs, and Dennis got saved. Saved by coming down with Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré syndrome, which paralyzed him from the neck down. In fact, Dennis said, yeah, that saved him from getting his legs broken. They realized that nature had done their work for him, so they didn't bother breaking a paralyzed man's legs. And it was about the same time that Allison, his wife, gave birth to their first child. This is 1979, as I recall. And anyway, Dennis, he was a veteran, right? Vietnam, medic, etc. And so Dennis ended up, again, every time they get their company stolen, he'd be destitute. They'd be destitute, homeless. And so anyway, they were once again destitute. And so the only place Dennis could really get treated was the VA hospital. Yeah, being a Vietnam veteran gave him that. But VA hospitals, in fact, if you ever watch the movie Born on the 4th of July, they depict VA hospitals as these hellholes. Well, that was accurate. Yeah, so VA hospitals were terrible places, and every bit as bad as depicted in Born on the 4th of July. And in fact, the VA staff there nearly killed Dennis 3 times through their negligence. Yeah, in fact, they put him on experimental steroid treatment, and then 3 times "Oh, we forgot to give you steroids," and he almost died from a steroid withdrawal, like 3 times. It's crazy. And so, and in fact, he had to leave the hospital to survive. And then Allison actually took enough steroids to wean him off the steroids and nurse him back to health. And eventually, Dennis got to where he could stand again. But to this day, he has no sense of equilibrium. If he closes his eyes, he falls over. Yeah, so he had permanent brain damage from his Guillain-Barré. Um, and I've had to push him around in wheelchairs and stuff. Yeah, walking is not easy for Dennis. It hasn't been easy for I got over 40 years. But when he could walk again, he became a salesman for a medical emergency pendant. Something you wear around your neck and you could press it in case of medical emergency. Kind of like dialing 911 before there was 911. And so anyway, but Dennis immediately began thinking about how to sell them en masse. Dennis is always thinking that way, thinking big. In fact, his second daughter was born at that time. This is 1981. His second daughter was born at that time. And anyway, and Dennis, now that when he was in a wheelchair a lot, he could kind of walk, but he liked getting around a wheelchair better. And what happened was he it was time to get back involved in energy. In fact, he got some mall show where he was demonstrating all these energy saving wares. I think formaldehyde, the foam probably was part of that, but it also was different. A number of energy saving technologies that have been or now coming to market, since the energy crisis. And anyway, put it on the mall. And one of Dennis's associates had this solar system he wanted to demonstrate. And Dennis considered solar systems to be a scam. And back then they really were. They really didn't work. In fact, most companies sold them just to take advantage of Jimmy Carter's tax credit, which reimbursed 40% of the sales cost up to a $10,000 retail price, which meant $4,000 credit. Yeah, so a lot of the solar companies were really back then. They were scams, and so Dennis didn't want to be involved with scam companies. And so this solar system he put it in the back by the bathroom so nobody could see it at this show. Well, anyway, what happened was during the course of this evening, this mall show, some old guy keeps coming up to Dennis asking about the solar system back there near the bathrooms, and Dennis kept trying to dissuade the guy and showing him, these other energy saving technologies. But this guy just kept coming back. I want to ask about the solar system. Anyway, Dennis finally said, "Okay, are you interested to pay $12,000 for this thing? Because that's what it costs." And the man said, "If it works like I think it will, I would." Well, that got Dennis's attention. And so anyway, they him and that associate of his went to that guy's home a few days later. And it turned out this guy was a scientist from DuPont. And DuPont were the masters of refrigeration. They're the ones who made Freon. And so what happened was this solar system was really not a normal solar system. It was the Lamco heat pump. It was the world's best heating system. And so again, I've written about this a lot. In fact, the interview I did with the Green Party guys, I described it a little more. But basically, what it was a heat pump, but the evaporator, the part where the heat exchange with the environment takes place, instead of looking like a car radiator, not much bigger than that, it was these big flat 8-foot panels that the Freon ran through, which provided about 400 square foot of surface area contact with the environment versus a few square feet that the standard air heat pumps had. And that huge surface area, what it did a couple things. One is that you were able to take way more energy out of the environment because of that. It was 400 square feet of contact. But also what it did was it raised the efficiencies. And so the air-to-air heat pumps would get a coefficient of performance of a 2-to-1, which meant for every unit of electricity you put in to run it, you get 2 units of heat out. The system, the company made it was called Lamco. The Lamco system, properly installed, got about a 6-to-1 in the same, so it's 3 times as efficient. And so anyway, it saved big on energy costs. In fact, if you had a gas furnace, that system would save you like 2/3 of your energy cost, converting from gas to that Lamco system. And so anyway, this And this was, again, this was in Maryland, near DuPont's headquarters there. And what happened was after this one sale, Dennis had another show, and this Lamco system now was a centerpiece of Dennis's show, and he was telling everybody, this thing's still working in the middle of the night. This thing's working while those solar systems just sit there looking good. Anyway, what happened is he got a bunch of leads, and then what happened was he, in fact, he split the leads with this other guy who was the guy who eventually demoed it for him. And Dennis worked his leads. And the first lead he worked was another DuPont scientist. And he goes to this DuPont scientist's home. In fact, Dennis, he drove an old broken down ambulance is what Dennis drove around as part of his pendant job. And so anyway, he drives over to this guy's house, and Dennis literally had a wheelchair, and a cane to get into the guy's home. And when he got in the home, the guy started peppering Dennis with technical questions, and Dennis was like, "Okay, here's the keys. Go back to my ambulance, and then go open the back, and you'll see a box in there, and it's a documentation of this heat pump, because I can't answer your questions." And so anyway, the guy did. And he came back in, and the guy started going through the documentation. And this guy was a Freon scientist at DuPont, and he was astounded by this heat pump. And anyway, so he started educating Dennis on what this heat pump was, how it worked, et cetera, why it worked the way it did, et cetera. And in fact, they spoke all night long. In fact, the sun rose while Dennis was still at the guy's house. And interesting though, I think it was that guy who said, I'm looking at the data, and the data the Lamco would say, and the Lamco would say it would get a COP of 3 under these conditions. And this guy said, my own back of the envelope calculation shows this should get at least a 6. And actually, about a month later, a Fortune 500 company had tested the Lamco system, and also, anyway, got twice what the Lamco literature said. And again, Dennis sees this, and then the scientist is telling him, it should do twice what this literature is saying. And Dennis actually confronted the owners of Lamco, and he said, I see this test data, and I was just spent all night with the DuPont scientists, and they're saying that the system should do twice what you're saying it is. And the owners confessed. They said, yes, we cut our performance data in half. Because when we'd go into engineering offices talking about COPs of 6 and stuff, they would laugh us out of the office with our impossible performance. And so we cut the performance in half to maintain credibility. Yeah. So anyway, Dennis said, I'm used to salesmen overstating what things can do, but I at least want to be able to say what it can do, not half of what it can do. So Dennis ran into the opposite problem with these guys. And no wonder they couldn't make their business work. Yeah, Dennis was the biggest thing ever to hit this company. And so what happened was that after Dennis had that night with that DuPont scientist, he was on fire. And anyway, as only Dennis could. So Dennis dusted off his shared savings program. And what his program was, and I've described this quite a bit in the past. What it was he had a program where he would sell the system to a customer for $10,000. And the down payment was $4,000. But the customer would get the $4,000 back in their tax return. So the customer essentially spent zero, none of their own money on the system, and they'd put it on their house for free. And then the system would only be paid, the $6,000 balance is only paid by proven energy savings. So again, when you're saving, 70%, of your previous heating costs, it paid for itself pretty quickly. And so this was Dennis, he called a systems for savings plan. It's the most brilliant and benevolent business strategy I ever saw or heard of. To this day, I've never saw anything as brilliant, as benevolent as that. Well, anyway, what happened was that, and I've written about this quite a bit, and I linked to it. But Dennis, when the regional dealer, when Dennis approached the regional dealer on selling these systems, the regional dealer was playing poker with Dennis and saying, well, I'll give you a month, you got to work. Anyway, Dennis was You're going to work off his, because he was supposed to buy a dealership for, I don't know, 10,000 or something. And Dennis said, well, how about I work it off in sales? And the guy was like, maybe. One day what happened was Dennis actually, in less than a month, he actually had a show at the Hope Hotel DuPont where almost 300 people were there. Champagne luncheon. I mean, it ran out of ballroom with dinner and champagne to unveil his Systems for Savings program. And that night, Dennis sold nearly 300 systems. And after the show was over, this regional dealer dropped his poker face and he said, "How can I be your partner?" He goes, "I've been the Lamco has not sold more than a few. They haven't sold 20 systems on the whole East Coast in the last few years, and Dennis just sold 300 systems in a month." And so anyway, Dennis was the biggest thing to ever hit it. And again, Dennis knew how to sell them. So this is what separated Dennis from all the rest of them. He knew how to sell it, but also like he did with the foam business, he brought his industrialization mentality, totally untrained. And this is where the genius Dennis is. So Dennis realized that. In fact, when Dennis got involved, half of the buyers were like these DuPont scientists. They were these geeks, and they were a scientist, and it was scientifically beautiful. And half the time they would install the system themselves. Well, the problem was that field installation, if you don't do it right, it wouldn't work right. And so when Dennis got involved, the Lamco system didn't have a very good reputation because it was very hit and miss depending on if you installed it properly or not. And so anyway, so Dennis immediately decided we need to professionally install these things. No more customers install it themselves, etc. And in fact, Dennis continued throughout his involvement for the next several years with these systems. He was continually trying to make these easier to install. And Dennis quickly, his dream was to carpet the United States with this heat pump. And in fact, Carrier, the world's largest heat pump manufacturer, the world's largest heat pump factory is in Tennessee, and Dennis actually camped out at that factory trying to get their attention for this heat pump that blows away the air-to-airs. The air-to-airs are incredibly inferior compared to the Lamco system properly installed. And what happened was he eventually got an audience with the plant manager of the Carrier facility. And he told him, he said, yeah, your performance better. The idiots in the field never install it right. And anyway, he goes, "Let me show you something, kid." And he takes Dennis out the back door of the office into the factory floor. And Dennis said, as far as the eye could see, it was sparks flying and stuff. And the plant manager said, "Hey, kid, so you got a nice heating system." "Yeah, but we sold 2 billion of these things, $2 billion of these last year. What did you do, kid?" Anyway, so really try to make Dennis feel pretty small. And anyway, what the plant manager didn't say and may have known, which is that the heat pump guys were in cahoots with the energy companies to produce pretty shoddy technology. It was really inferior, but it was easy to install. I wouldn't save really much money. It was kind of like a feint. It was sort of like a thing of you going from fossil fuels to electricity for your energy, but in the end, you weren't really saving much. But the Lamco system, you would save a ton. And so, anyway, the Carrier plant manager didn't talk about that part of it. He was a thinking man. He would have realized that, but maybe he didn't. Sometimes you're sold the propaganda. You never think about it again. You don't want to think about it again, or else your conscience might get to you. So anyway, Dennis, in fact, back with his UCS days, etc., Dennis wore out the leather in his shoes walking up and down Wall Street there all the time, looking for capital, looking for guys who could fund his latest dream. And what happened was again, when he got involved with the Lamco heat pump, he started thinking big, and he started going up and down Wall Street looking for financiers to finance, again, System for Savings, use the tax credit, put it on people's homes for free, and carpet the United States with it. He was good shooting for that. And actually, he found somebody who did understand. And it was the chairman of the board of American Express. He got it. He saw what Dennis was doing. He saw the lucrative. I mean, again, it was again, if you're never in the business, if you could have a $10,000 piece of equipment that was installed in somebody's home, which is secured in that way, and they paid 10 to 60, they paid gave you 4,000 down, and the 6,000 balance would be paid in a few years, and charge whatever interest you wanted, pretty much. And it was easy money. It was lucrative, incredibly lucrative. You wouldn't go for the quick capitalist kill of cash on the barrelhead, and the customer didn't know this if this thing worked or not. So Dennis's shared savings program took all the risk away from the customer, and that's why Dennis sold 100% of the systems, that he presented. I mean, literally, Dennis never didn't close a deal. He like more 100 deals in a row. He always closed a deal on selling these systems. And again, you're giving it away. You're putting on people's homes for free. Well, what do they have to lose? So again, that's how brilliant it was. And so the chairman of the American board of American Express got it. He understood. And so anyway, so Dennis was on the short strokes and then by this time, Dennis was working in Manhattan, Long Island. In fact, he lived in the Hamptons on Long Island. And they were going for it. They were going to go for $1 billion. The American Express put up $1 billion to fund Dennis's program and carpet the United States with it. And just then, in fact, by that time, Dennis was a 1/3 owner of Lamco. And in fact, in that early dealer, the one that loaned him the first system, etc. Anyway, what happened was that the Lamco owners stole several $100,000 from Dennis. And Dennis was living in Southampton at Long Island. Yeah, he was living large at the time. And then what happened was that mobsters had gotten to Dennis's that partner guy. And so anyway, the mobsters basically one day they said, we'll kill you unless you sign your company over. And this is right after the Lamco guys had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from Dennis. And so Dennis had to sign his company away. And in fact, the mobsters who took the company, in fact, that partner guy that Dennis, he was never seen again. Dennis said he probably got cement shoes. And then they ran a real scam and they took in like $1 million of dealer money before they folded the operation. And Dennis was on the sidewalk, penniless once again. And it blew apart the deal with American Express, obviously. Yeah, they were concerned about the patent, which was worthless anyway. But anyway, so this is what happened. And so yeah, it was America's greatest opportunity to have true energy savings. Yeah, in fact, to this day, it was the biggest opportunity I think there ever was to really get onto a different energy consumption path in this country. It was lost by people's greed and criminality. And anyway, so Dennis had his company stolen. By that time, his third child was born. He had a son. So he had 2 daughters and a son by that time. And this is late 1983. And Dennis sold well over 1,000 systems by that time. And among customers' homes, also commercial hot water installations were big, huge winners and stuff. Installed properly. Nothing else in the world performed like this. It was again the world's best heating system. Well, anyway, in late 1983, Dennis, again, he and his wife were once again homeless, destitute, and Dennis went back home to Yakima for Christmas to visit his family and introduce him to his son. In fact, in my earlier post, I mentioned that when Dennis left home at age 13, he also told his father, he said, Dad, you don't have to move around following the harvests and plantings. You could stay here and make it. And what happened was his father actually never left Yakima after that and actually became a professor at the local college there in Yakima. And so, yeah, so they ended up living there. He lived the rest of his life in Yakima. His father and mother. And then his sister lived there. In fact, still does, I believe. And so what happened was that Dennis went back there to Christmas in 83 to Yakima. And they'd been there only a few days, and then his son died of crib death. So Dennis lost 2 of his children. Yeah, 2. He had 4 children, 2 died as infants. And once that happened, his son died of crib death. It's just, yeah, in fact, it devastated his wife, obviously. And anyway, Dennis, he had nothing to go back to on the East Coast. And so he was sort of like rudderless for a moment, except what happened was you read the newspaper and these full page ads by the electric companies on energy conservation. And they were all promoting electricity energy conservation. And Dennis was like surprised by this. And what happened was that Dennis had stumbled into an energy crisis. And what had happened was back in the Nixon days, so the Nixon go-go days, when Nixon wanted to put 1,000 nuclear reactors in the United States by the year 2000, a study showed that Washington State would run out of electricity soon. In fact, Washington State, because of all the hydroelectric projects, all the rainfall, snowfall, had the cheapest electricity in the world. It was a 1 penny per kilowatt hour. In fact, many electric intensive industries were headquartered in Washington State because that aluminum refining was one of them. In fact, today, Google has its big data centers right next to the hydroelectric plants there in Eastern Washington. So all this cheap electricity from the hydro projects. Well, anyway, when you're living in a state with the world's cheapest electricity, selling energy conservation equipment, particularly electricity using conservation equipment, wasn't like there was no market for it. And in fact, what happened was that because electricity was 1 penny a kilowatt hour, there were many homes in Washington which were called all electric. So they heated with electric resistance, which is extremely expensive anywhere else. But at 1 penny a kilowatt hour, people could do it. And so what happened though was when Dennis was there, it went from 1 penny to 3. It tripled, and electric has already tripled. In fact, today they're 16 cents or 17 or something. And anyway, so Dennis saw these full page ads, and all of a sudden he's going, "Geez, my heat pump, there'll be a market for it here." And so Dennis started trying to revive his business there in Yakima, and he actually ended up, I don't know if running afoul is the right word, but basically the oligarchy. So every town, every county, every state, every nation in the world, there's all these ruling oligarchies. And so the local ruling oligarchy, one of the ruling oligarchs there in Yakima, took Dennis aside and said, "You got to work with me if you want to do business in this town." And so what happened was Dennis became this guy's partner. And this guy, he owned the Pepsi distributorship or whatever, but this guy he wasn't Dennis. And so Dennis started trying to make it happen. And this guy was a real obstacle for Dennis. And in fact, Dennis wasted a year with this guy. In fact, after about a year, the guy told people he didn't need Dennis anymore. Dennis said, "All righty." But before that, Dennis was actually experimenting with his heat pump there in Yakima in the summertime. And what happened was the in Eastern Washington, Yakima, it was all the orchards. So this was breadbasket of Washington State. A lot of all these farms that were irrigated from the runoff from the Cascades, etc. And they used hot water, but they actually heated it not with electricity, but with like natural gas. And so Dennis's heat pump could displace natural gas heating. In fact, it was going to do that. And in fact, that would also increase electricity use. So actually there in Yakima, the electric company sent an engineer to go help Dennis, to consult with him so he could beat out the natural gas people. And what happened was that Dennis was talking with this guy, and then Dennis said, "Yeah, but the big market in this day is all these all electric homes, or you put this heat pump on." And when Dennis said that, this engineer's eyes get this big around, like a deer in the headlight look, and he flees because he realized that Dennis was it was gonna be bad for electric company business that Dennis's heat pump started replacing all electric homes, because he would save 85% of the heating costs at a COP of 6. Well, anyway, what happened was this, and again, it was the biggest municipal bond default in American history to that time. What happened in Washington State? They floated billions of dollars these bonds to build 5 nuclear power plants, and the nuclear power plants always had cost overruns like crazy. And it was a whole huge boondoggle. Only one plant got completed; the other 4 got mothballed, and then it was a municipal bond default. In fact, when I lived with my grandparents when I got out of college in early '82. I would watch the evening news with them every night. And it's the only way I could hang with my grandparents is sit there and watch the evening news with them, Seattle local news. And that bond default was the headline every night that winter. And they finally call it's called WHOOPS, WHOOPS, because the acronym of the organization that flowed those bonds was Washington Public Power Supply System. WPPSS is the acronym, and so it got called WHOOPS in the vernacular. So anyway, so WHOOPS was this big disaster, and Dennis unwittingly walked in the middle of that as electricity costs were skyrocketing, and so Dennis all of a sudden saw a market for his heat pump. And the electric companies were actually encouraging people to get air-to-air heat pumps, which at a COP of 2 would save you 50% over baseboard electric. And what Dennis eventually discovered, though, is that it was kind of a scam on the public. Because what was happening is that the electric companies would subsidize it. So if you want to, we'll help pay for your heat pump and put it on your house. But the way they paid for it was raising everybody else's rates. So that was one of the reasons it was skyrocketing, was to pay for these heat pumps. So anyway, what happened was Dennis didn't realize that a COP of 6 and 85% savings was way more than they had in mind. He didn't understand that. In fact, he thought he'd get a ticker tape parade from electric companies because they had these full page ads wanting conservation. And Dennis said, if they like air to airs, they're going to love mine. Well, wrong. Yeah, it was a threat. All the electric companies could see was billions and billions of dollars of lost revenues if Dennis's heat pump carpeted Washington State. And in fact, Amory Lovins, this noted alternative energy guy, wrote an article. In fact, when I saw Dennis in September, he mentioned this, where Lovins wrote an article around that time about what's called good load and bad load. So Dennis's heat pump was bad load. It saved too much. Yeah, so Dennis's heat pump was too good. It saved too much money, saved too much energy. So this is called bad load. And so the electric companies are like, we had to take it out. But in Yakima, none of that happened because Dennis was messing around with this oligarch who didn't know what he was doing. And what happened was in October of '84, when this oligarch was telling people he didn't need Dennis anymore, Dennis said, okay, we're done. And Dennis packed his family in this beat up station wagon and drove over the Cascade Range. It was snow and stuff. Dennis said it was a death-defying drive over the Cascades to get into Seattle. And Dennis showed up to Seattle with his family, $20 in his pocket, and a beat up station wagon, and nowhere to sleep. That's how he arrived in Seattle. 8 months later, Dennis was worth $50 million. And that's the kind of explosive business growth that Dennis's companies would have. So what happened was in Seattle when Lamco owners stole that money from Dennis, and in fact one of the dealers stole the patent. So they stole the patent and the patent was worthless anyway. In fact, American Express corporate America likes patents, but the patent for this heat pump was really pretty useless. It really wasn't. Yeah, the proximity of the expansion valve of the panel was the only patentable part of that. So it really wasn't. It was a pretty worthless patent. But American Express didn't know that, and this guy who stole the patent didn't know that. And what happened was when Dennis got to Seattle, there was a bank actually building Dennis's the Lamco heat pump from the original patent drawings. It was so primitive. I mean, the guys, that was like a decade of R&D had improved the heat pump, and they were still building them based on the original patent. They had some kid about my age who was the engineer in charge, who was an idiot, unfortunately. And that's another story I'll tell later. But it's a thing where Dennis shows up and he goes to this bank and he goes, "Hey guys, I'm here to save you." And then they're like, "Who the hell are you?" Anyway, and Dennis, yeah, in fact, Dennis still tried to save him, but they resisted him all the way and went out of business. The bank went out of business because of their foray into this business. And in fact, 100 companies came and went around the Lamco heat pump. Dennis is the only guy who knew how to make it work. And basically, his marketing plan was the key to that, but also his professionalization of installation was also a big part of that. And R&D. So Dennis spent over $1 million of R&D on the heat pump to size the component to make it, again, the best it could be. So Dennis again, his initial orientation was marketing and sales. And so what happened was with Dennis always did this. He said, okay, if I can get stack up contracts this deep, for these nothing down, you know, systems, then he figured he'd get the attention of a bank because it was this incredibly lucrative loan to make for a bank. Yeah, it was a dream come true for a banker and financier. And so Dennis's deal was, I'm just going to sell contracts like crazy, and then get somebody to start. Yeah, Dennis always just wanted somebody who could build and install them as fast as Dennis could sell them. Dennis really didn't want to get involved in building them and installing them, etc. But he had to because everybody else failed. So Dennis had to get involved in all areas of it because of that. And what happened was, Dennis stacking up these contracts again, and again, this bank that went out of business kept giving him the cold shoulder. Anyway, and one day Dennis met with a bank officer at a bank, and he told Dennis, he said, I look at your deals, I see nothing. In fact, looks like an amazingly great program, but I've been told not to do business with you. One bank will not do business with you, and I've heard that you're not going to get anybody in the area to get any banks in the area will get involved with you. And he said, I don't know who's off the record. I don't know, but somebody is out to try to get you and to wipe you out. And Dennis didn't at that time, he had no idea. He was like, what? Somebody's trying to do this? Yeah, he had no idea. Well, it turned out it was electric companies that were doing this, but he didn't know it at the time. And so anyway, when he was shut out from all the Seattle banks, he started casting his net and he found a company in Spokane that called Selectors. And it was the founder and owner was a guy named John Spickard. And John was like the chairman of the board of American Express. He saw it. He got it. He saw what Dennis was doing, saw the genius of it, and he wanted in. What did he want in? And so what happened was he basically said, Dennis, I will finance these, but I want a piece of the action. I want a piece of the company. And what he did was he had an employee who put Dennis in touch with a person who sold shell companies. And the shell company is a company that was, it's kind of a paper company. It was all registered with the SEC, et cetera, but it had a company with kind of no assets. But it could enter into a contract with a real company, and the real company put its assets into the shell, and the shell all of a sudden would become publicly traded. The stock would sell for the public. It was a quick way to go public, and it was legit. It was a legit way to do that. It was a common way that companies could quickly go public. And so the dentist did a deal with the shell company to do that. And John, his company, John got 10% of the company, Dennis got 80%, and then the other 10% went to the old shell owners, some other Dennis investors, and sold to the public. And again, and Dennis's stake, his 80% ownership was worth $50 million by I think June of that year of 85. And right then, just as this financier comes aboard, this contractor stacked up. Dennis lined up a factory in California to build his heat pumps. It was, in fact, the Carter's tax credit would expire at the end of the year. So Dennis was one of the things that frustrated Dennis so much was that Carter's tax credit was just a license to print money, and he had been dealing now with these idiots in the industry for the previous 4 years and kept getting his company stolen. It was insane. And so anyway, Dennis was like one last run out before the tax credit expired. And Dennis still thought the other companies would love him. In fact, he rigged up one of his heat pumps on a truck and it was in the parking lot of an electric company, begging them to come out and just see it. And what he didn't know was that they knew all too well who he was, what he had, and they were terrified. Again, they just saw Dennis as an existential risk to the electric companies. Yeah, he was bringing far more energy conservation than they had in mind. And the BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration, in fact, this hitman, Bill Delp, if I right to that part. So there was a hitman named Bill Delp. I named him because he died earlier this year. And his job was to take out Dennis's company. He approached Dennis's company. I'll get to that in a second. So what happened was it's all happened within like a few weeks. And what happened was that the electric companies unmasked themselves. And an electric company called a press conference when they called Dennis's company a scam and called for an attorney general's investigation on Dennis's company. And Dennis was, again, he was blown away. This was like he'd done everything he could to attract their interest, and now they're calling it a scam and trying to get him prosecuted. Yeah, and then Dennis realized, he started realizing that, okay, he was, they weren't his friends. They thought he would love him. He thought they would love him. That wasn't the case. And so what happened was he soon got contacted by a woman from the Attorney General's office named Betsy. So Betsy was she was this hatchet lady from the Attorney General's office. Let's start this investigation of Dennis's company. And it was fraudulent. The investigation was fraudulent from the beginning. It's all fraudulent. She was a hit woman, just like Bill was. In fact, they worked together. So Betsy and Bill worked together. In fact, attack from the outside, try to take it out from the inside. In fact, I call it inside-outside job. And so this is, in fact, I've seen this more than once now. I experienced it more than once. Um, and about the same time, Chase Manhattan Bank wiped out Dennis's manufacturing in California. In fact, I talked to the president when Dennis was in jail later on. He told me, yeah, the Chase Manhattan Bank wiped out his company, the factory. So Dennis had to build his own factory. And in Yakima, Dennis picked up a guy named Stan. In fact, I call him Mr. Engineer in my writing off the scrap heap, and his real name was Stan. And actually, Stan led the engineering teams that designed the Boeing 707, which was the world's first mass-produced airliner. In fact, Stan also supervised construction of the world's largest building, the 747 manufacturing facility in Everett. And then Stan became its first plant engineer, plant superintendent. In fact, one of Stan's buddies was Frank Lloyd Wright. This is the kind of people that Stan ran around with. And Stan, though, got bladder cancer, got eased into retirement in his early 60s. And that's when Dennis met him, picked him off the scrap heap there in Yakima. And Dennis, brought Stan with them to Seattle from Yakima. And Stan built Dennis's heat pump factory. So Dennis had to build his own factory. So Stan was the guy who built it. And again, if you built the world's biggest builder, if you built a factory for 747s, building a factory with these heat pumps wasn't too big a chore for Stan. And around the same time all that was going, that's when Bill approached Dennis. And he said, hey, I'm a consultant for electric companies. I can smooth things with you in the electric companies. And Dennis, he didn't fool Dennis for a second. Dennis realized that Bill was not who he presented himself as. And Dennis's wife also said, this guy's up to no good. And Dennis said, yeah, but I want to keep my enemy close to where I can see him. And so what happened was Dennis hired Bill to work out things with electric companies. And instead, Bill tried to incite a mutiny in the company, which was what his job was. His job was to try to take it out from the inside. In fact, Bill was this, again, psychopath, a very talented psychopath. And he ended up sleeping with the women there. In fact, his manipulations caused one woman to kill herself and commit suicide. And then Bill actually showed up to her funeral and saying that Dennis was the reason she committed suicide. And Dennis had no idea what had happened. But about a week after she died, her family came into Dennis's office and told him what had happened. And when Dennis realized what Bill had done, and he realized that Bill was working for the electric companies, that was Dennis's radicalizing moment. Yeah, they had actually killed somebody to protect their market. And so, yeah, that was Dennis. There was no looking back for Dennis after that. He was thoroughly radicalized by, in fact, he wrote an anonymous note. I think the Attorney General of Electric Company said, you guys drew first blood. And so what happened was that Betsy, with her so-called investigation, which was incredibly unprofessional, again, until you've been prosecuted by these kind of people, you can't believe how unprofessional they are, how much they lie. I mean, they're criminals, so these so-called public defender people are criminals. And this was an early instance. In fact, the earliest instance I realized that the biggest protection racket in the world is protecting the public. All the consumer protection laws they're abused like crazy to wipe out competitors for the big vested interests. That's what it's really used for. Yeah, consumer protection laws are a sham. the way they're enforced. It's all a sham. So, I mean, they may do some good once in a while, but they're mainly there as a weapon to wipe out any upstarts. That's what it's really used for, which I was about to learn. So what happened was during the investigation, Dennis actually was contacted by the state of Indiana, who, again, this part of the Rust Belt, back from the oil crises, the recessions, and Dennis was looking at relocating his facility, his whole company to Indiana, because they were like rolling out the red carpet for industry. I was like, hey, let's put the world's biggest heat pump manufacturer, let's build it in Indiana. And what happened was, in the middle of this investigation, Betsy was always playing like, oh, we just have a couple little technical issues that we're trying to work through. She was always trying to downplay it. But Dennis, again, had enough experience with this kind of stuff. Actually, not enough, because he's like, Betsy, I'm going to Indiana for a business trip, but I won't go if you need me to stay around to answer your questions. And Betsy said, oh, no, it's fine. Go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead, go to Indiana, have fun. Anyway, he goes to Indiana, and then like Monday morning, the guy who set up the meeting with literally the governor's advisors said, Dennis, what the hell is going on? Dennis said, what's going on? Well, what happened was when Betsy stabbed him in the back. So what happened was when Dennis went to Indiana, Betsy went to the press and did this big splash of this big lawsuit against Dennis's company for all these laws he was breaking and everything while Dennis was out of town. At the same time, then Bill tried to incite a mutiny on the inside. Well, again, this is how this kind of stuff works. And so they were setting Dennis up to try to take his company down while he was out of town. Public servants. Well, anyway, so what happened was Dennis immediately got on a plane back to Seattle. In fact, I write about this. I don't in my summary. I don't talk about this, but it's the thing where on the airplane back, Dennis wrote an article, and when he got home, like on Tuesday, he went to the Seattle Times and he paid for a full page ad, which was Dennis's letter. And what happened was it ran under the weekend editor's guide, and it basically snuck through. And so then there was a full page ad in the Seattle Times. It was like in the Sunday paper, and it was and describing what the Attorney General had done, etc. And Dennis later heard the Attorney General's face, and this guy, the Attorney General's a gangster. In fact, he almost became governor several years later, but his face turned crimson as he was reading Dennis's article describing the underhanded things they had done. And in fact, the Attorney General got sacks full of mail from the public complaining about what they were doing to Dennis's company. Anyway, so Dennis got back, and Bill had tried to incite a mutiny, but Bill didn't have much traction with Dennis's people because his company was still doing well. And so anyway, and Dennis, yeah, there's this, and Bill never did any of the things he promised. Dennis hired the guy to do nothing, essentially. Dennis hired the guy to try to destroy Dennis's company, essentially. And Dennis said, okay, here's the deal, Bill. You go home with pay. Well, send him with pay for a month. But if you contact anybody associated with my companies, you're fired. Bill had been found out, and so Bill kicked into overdrive. In fact, he flew to Spokane and met with John Spickard, trying to scare John Spickard, not to pull out of Dennis's company, and etc. And again, it was a hitman doing. Bill was earning his pay as a corporate hitman working for the electric companies. And when that woman died, and this was, in fact, she died on Halloween in 1985. In fact, Bill was using her to try to get the files of Dennis's customers so they could call the customers. And again, they were doing everything they could to prevent these systems from being installed. And when that failed, or again, he killed somebody in his quest. And then they kept breaking into Dennis's factory every night. And all sorts of criminal stuff. And then all of a sudden, OSHA shows up for a surprise inspection. IRS, was going to do an audit. And then, in fact, what happened? Bill filed a phony bankruptcy suit in federal court there, which should never have been accepted by the courts because there was no documentation for their claims. They said there were five. The law said you had to have a minimum of 5 creditors to take a company into bankruptcy, but there had to be 5 creditors with bona fide claims. Like, here's the invoice, didn't pay it. those five people had nothing. They had stories for why they thought Dennis owed them all this money, including Bill. Yeah, Bill, who worked there like 6 weeks, never did an honest day's work, said Dennis owed him $5,000 in vacation pay. In fact, 5,000 was the de minimis number. That's why he came up with 5,000. It was all fraudulent. And the courts knew it, and the federal courts were part of it also. So it was a full court press by the electric companies to destroy Dennis's company, including the media, Attorney General's office, all the way down the line. So Dennis, after this woman's death, on Halloween, Dennis had 2 months to install those systems. In fact, only 400 customers that put down payments on, but the only ones that didn't cancel once Dennis started getting attacked in the media and the government, et cetera. And so, in fact, what happened was Betsy took those customers hostage and John Spickard hostage and forced Dennis to settle a civil suit. And the civil suit was all about, it hinged on one thing. She had a letter from some guy who said that he thought the electric companies were going to pay for his heat pump instead of anyways, it was some crazy misunderstanding of what Dennis's sales pitch. But she had it, and she basically got Dennis on a civil law that said, you misunderstood one person in the state misunderstood one thing you said. I got you dead to rights. That was all she had. And this 48 count lawsuit she did was all fraud. It was all made up stuff, all made up stories and a bunch of lies. But 47 counts sure sounds impressive. Yeah, 47 lies strung together. So it's like there's no accountability. So the Attorney General can lie, and you have to defend yourself against all of that. And what happened was Betsy hadn't been with the Attorney General's office that long before she was assigned this. In fact, so Bill's a psychopath. Betsy wasn't. She's probably more sociopath. And what happened was when she joined the Attorney General's office, she had a boyfriend. In fact, she was telling the boyfriend she's off to be a crime fighter and protect the public and stuff. And this ex-boyfriend actually knew people who worked at Dennis's company and knew what she had done. And in fact, what happened was she was on the hot seat at Dennis's company when it wasn't fun. Dennis wasn't easy to kill. And so she got drugged through the mud trying to take down Dennis's company. And anyway, one night, her old boyfriend called her up. And he said, hey, Betsy, you crime fighter, you. And he started reciting to her the lives she had ruined at Dennis's company and the lives she had ruined with her hit attempt on Dennis's company. Anyway, she got her nose rubbed in it. And in fact, a couple weeks after her final confrontation with Dennis, she quit. She quit the Attorney General's office and then taught law school after that. Betsy was the best. Of all the people I saw sicked on Dennis's company, she was the best of them because her conscience finally got to her. In fact, funny thing is, about a year later, Dennis was on an airplane flying somewhere. And Betsy was in the seat next to him. Now, when Dennis sat down, he saw Betsy there. I can sit somewhere else. Anyway, she goes, no, it's okay. You can sit down. Anyway, so Dennis had a plane ride with Betsy. Anyway, Dennis started off said, Betsy, so I just have one question. How do you sleep at night? And Betsy goes, well, you'll notice I don't work for them any longer. So he goes, yeah, they asked me to do stuff I wasn't comfortable doing. But she also defended herself. Basically, her argument was basically I was following orders. In fact, Dennis said, that was Eichmann's defense. I was just following orders. So yeah, that was Betsy's defense. I was just following orders. Anyway, so Betsy, back in 2017, even though she was a law school professor, she got disbarred in 2017 in Washington State for looting a client's account for more than $100,000. And she was the best of those sick on Dennis's company. Yeah, she couldn't keep her hand out of the cookie jar. In fact, during the vendetta, what happened was that Bill was stealing documents from Dennis's companies, and they ended up in Betsy's files. So these are stolen documents, ended up in Betsy's possession, and Dennis threatened an FBI probe of Attorney General's office because of this, and Dennis because he had helped bust the mob. He made I guess it was because he had pull with the FBI still, and so anyway, he threw out an FBI probe. And anyway, the next day, Dennis gets this express mail package from Betsy with all these documents that Bill has stolen, and saying, "I didn't," In fact, earlier when Bill had asked, and Dennis had asked her about Bill and her relationship, she says he never saw the guy, didn't know who the guy was. Others had seen them together, and again, here she is with all these documents that Bill's attorney gave her, stolen from Dennis's company. Anyway, yeah, I go on and on about that kind of stuff. So anyway, yeah, just criminals and gangsters. Let's see here. Well, anyway, so what happened was is that after that woman died, Dennis had 2 months to install this 400, build and install those 400 systems. Or if they didn't get installed by the end of the year, the people were out their deposit. Yeah, they wouldn't get the anyway. So it was a race to the finish line. It was heroic. I wasn't there for it. I just again Dennis was the only guy I heard about this from. I worked at the company for months, so like that was a heroic act to get those 400 systems installed by year end. In fact, they were installing them on New Year's Eve. And in fact, one of the murder attempts Dennis survived was on New Year's Eve in 1985. Like a guy came to his house, some big hulking guy comes to Dennis's door, and he goes, "You're coming with me. You come with me, I won't kill your family too." Anyway, Dennis is like, "Okay." Now Dennis is ex-special forces, so he may have been able to still been a tough guy to kill. But Dennis decided to go with the guy. Well, anyway, just as we're walking out of Dennis's house, all of a sudden all these cars pull up, and it was all Dennis's installer crews there because they were coming to celebrate New Year's Eve, swimming in Dennis's swimming pool in the bottom of his house. So Spicker sold Dennis this mansion there in Bellevue as part of again getting a piece of the action. And so Dennis had a swimming pool in the basement. So all these installer crews came to swim in Dennis's basement and party out that night, just as the assassin is escorting Dennis from his home. And Dennis turned to the assassin and said, "Well, I don't think it's going to work tonight, pal. Sorry." And again, Dennis let the guy go. And this is like when he let the mobsters go before. It's like he lets the assassins go, and then they kind of leave him alone. They go, "Okay, again, it turns out that the mobsters had more integrity than the government officials did. This is what I got to see this repeatedly. So mafia guys, assassins, would have more personal integrity than the officials that were sick on Dennis's companies and media personnel and all these kind of people. It's like, yeah, it's how the world really works. So once Dennis got the 400 systems installed, so the fraudulent bankruptcy suit. So the judge actually, again, it was criminal to even accept the suit. It had no standing in the court. It should not have been accepted by the courts. But they were all part of it. So yeah, even federal courts were part of this. Take out this company, and what happened was that the judge put the company into de facto bankruptcy receivership, et cetera. And so Dennis couldn't maneuver. He couldn't find any, they were basically, he was trapped financially and able to maneuver all these death blows that were being aimed at him. And so basically it slowly strangled the company. And in early 1986, the tax credit was gone. Yeah, Dennis never sold another heat pump in that state. And the company was slowly dying. But its records were a shambles, and Dennis was still trying to see if he could survive. He was still trying to make it happen. And in February of that year, that's when this Wade guy is down there in Los Angeles feeling trapped in his career, and he made a desperate prayer. And this voice in his head said, "Hey, move to Seattle now. What do you have to lose?" And 10 days later, I'm interviewing with Dennis's company. And the rest is history. So anyway, I wanted to give some background of Dennis before he and I met, because that's very important background. Dennis's journey makes Indiana Jones look like Walter Mitty. Dennis, I saw him in 2013. I mentioned, I said, "You should have been dead how many times? 15, 20? No, and Dennis was more than that. So yeah, Dennis should be dead dozens of times over, from back when he left home at age 13, probably earlier during his migrant farm worker days. through Vietnam, through all these mob hit attempts, and just through almost being murdered in prison repeatedly, almost repeatedly being officials. And that I'll get to this later, but officials kept trying to get him murdered in the prison. Yeah, Dennis, that he's still alive is amazing. And Dennis is by far the greatest human being I've ever had the privilege of knowing, whose life story is unbelievable. To Joe Avers, totally unbelievable. But if you've actually been on the cutting edge of this stuff, very believable. And in fact, how to say it, he could trade notes with some, and not too many people live that long. But yeah, in fact, Dennis, what happened in Seattle there in 1985 was the greatest run ever made to bring alternative energy to the American marketplace. To my knowledge, that was the greatest run ever made. And the electric companies pulled out all the stops to end the threat, and they did. The woman died, lives were shattered. It was a total catastrophe. And more of that comes, but I'm just taking this up to the moment when I met Dennis. And so when my grandmother said I had this phone call, from this recruiter, and he said it got you ready for an interview that afternoon. Felt like a lightning bolt hit me, and I met with the controller, and I bowled him over. I was on fire. There are no other contenders for this job, and my job was to reconstruct the accounting records and create financial statements. That was essentially what I did for about 2 months. And that comes next, though. So that'll be my next post. So anyway, that's all for this little report. Bye.